There's a massive diplomatic effort happening right now, behind the scenes, that could totally reshape the war in Ukraine. But what if it all ends not with a clear victory, but with a frozen future? Welcome to the Global WarWatch Network. We're all about giving you clear, straightforward analysis on complex conflicts. If that sounds good to you, go ahead and hit that subscribe button now so you don't miss our future explainers. Okay, so let's get right into the heart of it. What if the path forward for Ukraine isn't about total victory for either side, but something else entirely? Picture this: a frozen front line, backed by ironclad security guarantees from the West, creating a standoff that looks a lot like the Korean Peninsula. Now, remember, that model did stop a huge, devastating war, but it also created one of the most tense, heavily armed borders on the planet. It's a really sobering thought, isn't it? So to really get our heads around this, here's how we're going to break it down. We'll start with what this Korea-style idea actually means. Then we'll look at the three main parts: the political plan, the security deal, and the economic package. After that, we'll get into the major roadblocks, and we'll finish with the big question: is this a real path to peace, or just hitting the pause button on the fighting? All right, so what are we really talking about with a Korea-style standoff? This isn't just a simple ceasefire. No, this is a whole comprehensive, multi-layered plan, what diplomats are calling a peace architecture, that's being hammered out right now by the US, Ukraine, and other key European powers.
And this term, peace architecture, think of it like a three-legged stool. It's a formal plan to end the war, and it's built on three pillars that have to work together. You've got the political agreement to freeze the front lines. You've got the security treaty to protect Ukraine going forward, and you've got the massive economic plan to rebuild the entire country. Each part is meant to hold the others up.
Okay, let's jump into that first pillar, the political blueprint. The number one goal here, the most immediate thing, is to stop the full-scale fighting by, well, literally freezing the battlefield right where it is. And the core of this whole political idea is what they're calling a Korea-style line of separation. Basically, it would establish a hard ceasefire line right along the current front, a line that would stretch all the way from Donetsk, cut through Zaporizhia, and go down to Kherson in the south. Now, this is a really, really important distinction to make. We're talking about a ceasefire line, not an international border. And that's the whole point. It freezes the active fighting, but it leaves the huge question of sovereignty unresolved. The idea is to create breathing room for diplomacy to actually work, instead of just accepting the current lines as the final map. So besides that ceasefire line, there are other crucial pieces to this political puzzle. There's a proposal for a demilitarized zone, a DMZ, which would be a buffer where heavy artillery is banned. The plan also calls for international oversight of the Zaporizhia nuclear plant, which is absolutely vital for safety. And importantly, this is all connected to a target date for Ukraine to join the EU, 2027, while making it clear that Kyiv can still keep fighting diplomatically to get its territory back. Of course, a frozen line is still incredibly vulnerable if it's not protected. And that brings us to the second pillar, forging a security shield. This is all about turning vague promises of support from the West into concrete, formal guarantees. What Ukraine is pushing for here is a security deal that's way stronger than anything they've had before. The absolute centerpiece would be a treaty that's ratified by the US Senate. Why? Because that would make it incredibly difficult for a future president to just pull out of it. It would also include ways to get military aid there fast, something like NATO's Article 5, plus deep integration of Ukraine's air defenses with the West, pre-positioned equipment on the ground, and a long-term NATO training mission. But, it's not all smooth sailing. There are definitely some sticking points. For example, some Western negotiators have floated the idea of putting a cap on the size of Ukraine's military. Well, as you can see from this quote, Kyiv has flat out rejected that. Their position is crystal clear. Deciding the size of their own army is their sovereign right, and they need it to be flexible enough to handle whatever Russia throws at them. And that brings us to the third pillar, which is every bit as critical as the other two: financing the future. Look, a secure Ukraine has to be a rebuilt Ukraine. So this part of the plan is all about unlocking the massive amount of money needed to get that done. So where does the money come from? Well, the first big injection of cash would come from a plan to use $100 billion of frozen Russian assets. That money would be put to work immediately for urgent needs. We're talking rebuilding infrastructure, power grids, and the enormous task of demining. But honestly, that's just the start. The much bigger goal is to create a brand new Ukrainian development fund. And the aim here is to pull together up to $400 billion by mixing public money with private investment to really kick the recovery into high gear. The scale we're talking about is just immense. And you can see where that money is meant to go. The idea isn't just rebuild what was destroyed, it's to build something better, something modern. The focus is on key areas like energy, tech, logistics, and agriculture. And, critically, getting this money is tied directly to Ukraine's path to joining the EU, meaning they have to keep pushing forward with anti-corruption and judicial reforms. So, we have the three pillars, right? A political freeze, a security shield, and basically an economic Marshall Plan for Ukraine. It sounds pretty solid on paper, but this is where things get really difficult. As we're about to see, there are huge unresolved obstacles. This is nowhere near a done deal. This table lays out the sticking points perfectly. But what's really fascinating here is the massive gap between what's being proposed and what the different sides will accept. Look at the DMZ. Ukraine says, okay in principle. Russia says, no way. Why? Because a real DMZ makes it harder to launch a future attack. Same goes for the nuclear plant. But the biggest gap, the absolute chasm, is over territory. Ukraine insists on its right to pursue its claims diplomatically, while Russia considers its annexations permanent and not up for discussion. These aren't just minor disagreements. They're completely opposite views of reality. All of this brings us to the final and most critical question of all. Is this whole ambitious plan a real pathway to a lasting peace? Or is it just a temporary pause in a conflict that could last for generations? You know, one of the most clever things about this whole plan is how it's structured. The three pillars, political, security, and economic, are actually designed as separate documents. And what that means is that even if the political talks about territory get stuck forever, the security guarantees and the economic aid can still move forward. It's a way to make sure Ukraine isn't left hanging while the diplomats argue. And so we end right back where we started. With this incredibly complex, ambitious, and, let's be honest, fragile plan on the table, the biggest question of all is still unanswered. Is this a durable pathway to peace that lets Ukraine rebuild and join the West? Or is it just putting a formal name on a temporary freeze in a conflict that's far from over? The answer to that question is going to shape the future of Europe for decades to come. And that's all we have for you in this explainer. Thanks for joining us here at the Global WarWatch Network. Hey, if you found this analysis helpful, do us a favor and hit the like button and share it with your network. And please, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We'd really love to hear your take, so drop your thoughts in the comment section below. And you can join our community on social media. All the links for that are in the description. Thanks again for watching.